Welcome, everyone, to eRotary Coastal Club. This is the speaker meeting, noon on Zoom, Central Standard Time, December 3rd, 2020. Today, we've got Dr. Denise Reed. She's had over 30 years of experience in the area of that we're looking at, of coastal issues in the United States and abroad. And Dr. Reed, as you get prepared for your presentation, what I'd just like to ask you, what has brought you to this point right now where you are in your career? And then in particular, what has made you interested in this topic of sea level rise?
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. So I think I've probably worked on sea level rise in one way or another for, 30, 40 years now. And partly because early in my career, I worked on how coastal wetlands respond to sea level rise. And so I did a lot of kind of boots on the ground research, trying to work out how they build up over time and things like that. So sea level rise is kind of implicit in that. About 25 years ago, probably, I sound old, don't I? I started working with state and federal agencies on how to do restoration planning for Louisiana. I've also worked quite a lot in California, in the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta on similar kinds of issues. And understanding sea level rise and how to use sea level rise information is kind of important in that. And so I've worked on probably 3 national climate assessments, 2, 3, and 4, I believe. And I've also been on National Academy panels where we actually had to come up with sea level rise rates for the West Coast. So it's kind of been, in there in all kind of different facets of my career. And so currently I am, as Philip said, a research professor gratis at the University of New Orleans. Gratis is not an acronym, it's a word, it just means I don't get paid. That also means I have to do anything, like parking permit and all kinds of things like that. But I just go in and pre-COVID, used to go in and use my office and hang out and talk to students and things like that now and again. Worked at LumCon originally down in Cocodrie, Louisiana. Worked at the University of New Orleans for around 20 years. And I worked in Baton Rouge for 5 years. And the last 3 or 4 years, I've really been working as an independent consultant. So I was asked today to talk a little bit about sea level rise. And so I'm like, well, what do you want to know about sea level rise? Maybe there are better people. And so I thought what I would do, knowing some of you really well, I don't think you need a primer on this. I think Philip gave me the idea that you all kind of understood the fundamentals and didn't need to be convinced. So I thought I'd kind of talk a little bit about kind of things that are on my mind, if you like, or things that I find kind of challenging about sea level rise issues when I'm trying to use sea level rise information or help others use it in different ways. So I'm going to share my screen now, Philip. We practiced this just now, so hopefully it will work. So I only have a few slides, which is very unlike me, as some of you know very well. So sea level rise is an ongoing thing. It's happening. I don't think there's, I'm not going to try to convince you of that or give you any evidence of that. I want to kind of stimulate some conversation about today is how we use information about future sea level rise and how, what do we really do with it? And one of the reasons that's a viable question to ask is because there is no one prediction of future sea level rise. The curve that this family of curves that you can see on the screen now are all relatively recent, relatively official predictions of sea level rise would be. And so you can see, and these are all normalized to start in either 1992 or 2000 and go through 2070. And so that's the bottom axis, and then the vertical axis is sea level rise in centimeters. Sorry, it's in centimeters. That's the way most of the sea level rise information is. And so, so why are there so many curves on here? Well, there are so many curves. There are a number of things that we think about when we think about how fast or how much, and those are different quantities, speed and amount, sea level is going to rise in the future. One of those is what's going to happen in the atmosphere. And so part of the range here from just over 120 centimeters down to just over 20 centimeters depends on what assumptions you want to make about what's going to happen, either in terms of emissions, in terms of emissions into the atmosphere, changing in greenhouse gases, which for the most part is dependent on human behavior, which of course is really difficult to predict. And so the way that is usually considered is in a scenario approach. Okay, we're going to consider this, people are going to do this, and then therefore emissions are going to be like that, and therefore the atmosphere is going to look like this. Or we're going to assume people are going to do another thing and emissions will be different, et cetera, et cetera. So we get like a set of emissions scenarios that people use. And the international kind of terminology for that is representative concentration pathways, but we don't need to worry too much about that for today. So that's one source of variation here. Another source of variation here is in actually how we think about how the ocean and the ice masses of the Earth, the cryosphere, respond to changes in atmospheric conditions. So you've got one set of issues, which is about what is the atmosphere going to look like, and then another set of scientific issues, which are about how the water part of the system is going to respond to that. And so you're probably familiar with the different ways in which that can happen. As the atmosphere gets warmer, the oceans expand a bit. And so that leads to sea level rise. But probably one of the main issues, and there's also some issues with wind patterns and currents and things like that, which are really important if you're on like the west coast of the US, where you're subject to kind of forcing across the whole of the Pacific coming at you. Not quite as important for us in the Gulf of Mexico. But then the other one is what's going to happen to ice masses, glaciers melting, particularly ice caps, Greenland and Antarctica. And you see this in the news all the time. That there's a new study that comes out that says this about what's going to happen to ice shelves, and a new study that comes out that says that's what's going to happen to ice shelves. And a lot of this is about how we understand how the warming water interacts with the ice that comes down from the upper parts of Greenland towards the coast, or the interior parts of Antarctica towards the coast. How that ice, when it meets the coast there, interacts with the water. Very, very complex dynamics in there. And so that's another set of reasons why you have different assumptions about those processes that leads to different sets of predictions about the future. And then there are models, the numerical models, the kind of sets of computer code that we use to represent those processes, and how well they simulate one aspect of this kind of very complex system versus another one. So you end up I don't know how many there are in here, 20 odd or something, curves on there. So if you're talking to, people in Du Large, Charles, I'm not exactly quite sure where you are there, but somewhere like that, or where I live in Montague, in Louisiana, or if we're in Florida or somewhere like that, then Sanibel Island, then, we want to talk to people about sea level rise. What do we tell them? Do we tell them that sea level rise is going to, by 2070, is going to be 120 centimeters higher than it was, 20 years ago? Or do we tell them it's going to be 20 centimeters higher? And there's quite a lot of difference there. And it's going to make quite a lot of difference to how they react. And so, I think that's kind of like, that's the challenge here. It's not that sea level is going to rise. It's going to be how much is it going to rise, by when. And so you can also somewhat see on here that different curves have different speeds of rise. There's not much difference when we look at 2030, 10 years out from now, 20 years out from now. But when we start talking, 2060, 2070, which is really not that far away, some of you may be able to imagine still being around at that time. Probably not me, but some others of you. But certainly, our children. This is the next generation here. And so, what are they likely to see? What are we going to tell them that they're going to have to deal with? How can they plan for that? So, Another thing about this, which I thought that you might find interesting, which is a kind of, I come from the research background here, thinking about this and read lots of technical papers about all these things about how ice masses change and all of those dynamics talked about just now. This is a diagram which is a couple of years out of date now, from a research paper that was put together, and what you're looking at is you've got time along the bottom axis here, and it starts at about I'll read it myself now, in the 1980s, and it goes through 2018, right? So that's the period that you're looking at here. And what's represented in those different colors and symbols on this graph are predictions that different studies have made over time. So somebody does a study, a research group does a study, and they come out with saying sea level rise is going to be between here and here, or sea level rise is going to be between there and there. And that's those bars that you see on here. And then the three panels, the top one, the middle one, and the lower one, are like what have studies predicted is going to happen with sea level rise. The top panel is with high emissions into the atmosphere, middle one is medium emissions, and lower panel C is low emissions, right? So there's a difference in how much predicted generally, just because of what assumptions you make about, what's going to happen in the atmosphere. But what you see on here, what I think is interesting, if you just look at the top one for now, is that over time, if we think about, when I was just giving you my mini career history just now, I kind of started working with agencies on this kind of stuff in the early 1990s. And that's kind of when a lot of the panels start to be filled out here. Over that time period, there's been an enormous in what studies have said. And so it's very interesting here. If you look at this period about 2017, you get some studies coming out that say, wow. Oh, and by the way, these rates here, the sea level rise in meters here is by 2100. The graph I showed you before was prepared for coastal Louisiana, where we do our master plan process that goes out 50 years. So we're thinking about 2070 there. But this paper here is about predictions through 2100. And so you can see that there's a high point of green at about, lots of papers come out in 2017, or several, not just one, come out that say, wow, it could be well over 2 meters. And then another set of papers come out that say, no, it's probably going to be less than 1. It's like a ping pong ball. And look at it, how it's changed over time. That's really, so it's not just that the curves are all different as we look at the curves now, but it's changed a lot over time as we have, better understand, we think it's better understanding of how these processes work. We have better computers and algorithms or ways of representing it. Just one other dimension on that, and I don't want to go into this too much, but you're probably familiar with where there's two for us in the US, there's two kind of synthesis reports or sets of reports that come together. There's a US set of the National Climate Assessment. It's the US Global Change Research Program, which was initiated under statute, I believe, in the early 1990s, which is required to provide a report to Congress, I believe, every 4 years on the status of the climate. And so that National Climate Assessment, each 4 years, if they manage to get it together in 4 years, pulls together lots of information and comes up with a rate for the US, or a set of rates for the US for these different emissions pathways. There's another international effort called, under the auspices of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which represents a very large number of countries around the world, send scientists to work together on that. And they too come up with consensus reports that come out periodically that say, this is the current thinking about global sea level rise rates. And so So for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that produces periodically these big reports that get a lot of attention. This graph that I've got on the screen now represents how the predictions in those reports have changed over time by the width of that blue line, right? So when the blue line is wide, that means that the IPCC reports are predicting a range of, like on the left side here, 0 to 1 meter. And then you see there's a period between 2007 and 2013 where the IPCC predicted range, well, it could be this high, or it's gonna be at least this much, and it could be that much kind of thing, is a narrower band of blue lines, right? And so these consensus studies change over time, and not always in the same direction. And the other thing that is plotted on here, so the width of the blue bar is the consensus studies, what they're reporting. The kind of magenta colored symbols are those individual studies. And so what you see, what often happens is that government entities are kind of are loath to say, well, you know, we're going to latch on to this new study that just came out by so-and-so and so-and-so from Rutgers University because we think it's the best study we've ever seen. They tend to go with these consensus reports where a large number of scientists have come together and come to consensus. But what you find out when you plot it like this is that, you know, that could be really too low if these other studies are right. And so I thought that was kind of, it's another dimension to this. Okay, one more point, and then I hopefully we can have some kind of discussion on this. So what do we actually tell people that they should do with this information? Well, in Louisiana, we don't have any specific guidance on how to use sea level rise rates. California has some that they update regularly. In South Florida, there's a group in Florida called the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact on Climate Change, which is probably Miami-Dade, Broward counties, you know, up that southeast part. I think you can see that symbol in the bottom of the slide. They've been coming together for a number of years to produce kind of guidance. Okay, so if you're working in Broward County, you don't, in South Florida, you don't have to deal with all of those curves that I just showed you. What they're saying is these are the ones that you should use, and they do it through assembling a lot of scientists and really thinking about what's going on in South Florida and what to do with it. And so this is the guidance the guidance on sea level rise curves that should be used in South Florida. And this is the most recent, I think this was updated just at the end of 2019. So this is relatively recent. And so you can see on here the dates that it goes through. It's called Unified Sea Level Rise Predictions. They're really trying to say, okay, let's get everybody on the same page. So we don't have somebody in Miami-Dade, you know, building a road on the basis of this sea level rise, and somebody in Broward County next door, I think they're next door, building a road on the basis of this one. Right, and so there's some kind of consistency. I think that's the objective here, and so they've been able to come up with this. I'm not actually familiar with how they managed to how they managed to enforce it or anything like that. But what you'll notice here is it's guidance, but there's still more than one curve. So what do we do with it? Well, the other good thing about this is they actually provide advice about how, depending on what you're doing, how you should use these different curves. And so I've tried to extract that a little bit from the report. So this is directly from the South Florida report. Sorry about all the words on the screen here, but let me go back. So there's the median. Let me see if I can work out how to go backwards, which I might well not be able to do. There we go. So the median is the bottom one, intermediate, high, and high. And I'll just tell you now that they do not recommend the NOAA extreme curve be used for anything. So they're saying it's out there, but we're not recommending you use it. So there's the IPCC median, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. NOAA, intermediate high, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, government agency, produced this intermediate high and high curve. And all of these curves that you see on here are on that big family that I showed you at the beginning. But now we're only dealing with 4. Florida says, forget the top one. It's not relevant. So this is the bottom one. When do they say you should use the bottom one? Well, can be applied to most infrastructure projects before 2070, or projects whose failure would result in limited consequences to others, right? So if you're not going to affect anybody else, you could use the lower one because we're not so much worried about failure. So it goes on to say an example low-risk project might be a small culvert in an isolated area, right? It could have a short lifespan. Okay, I want to talk about these things in a bit. And here's the other two, the guidance for the other two. There weren't so much words, so I tried to put them on the same slide here. The middle curve there, the middle of the 3 that they address, projects in need of greater factor of safety related to potential inundation should consider designing for the intermediate high curve. Examples may include evacuation routes planned for reconstruction, communications infrastructure, critical government and financial facilities and infrastructure that wants a design life of more than 50 years. And then the high curve, they're saying that should be applied to major infrastructure, existing and proposed critical infrastructure. Critical projects include those that are not easily replaceable or removable, have a long design life, more than 50 years, and are dependent on other infrastructure. So they do give people some guidance. There is some guidance on which one to use. But for me, when I read this, I think the guidance kind of begs a whole other set of questions. And actually, for many of you on the phone have I think, probably encountered this and have more experience on the engineering side of things and actually building things. Because when I look at all the curves that I showed you at the beginning, when I look at that guidance in South Florida, it's still a real struggle for me, even though I can kind of assimilate all of this information. What guidance should we give to homeowners? What guidance should we give to communities? What kinds of infrastructure are they building? What should the state be using in its different investments, if it's doing roads or hospitals? I mean, one of those kinds of pieces of guidance from Florida was, if failure is not going to affect anybody else. I mean, I didn't actually realize that many people built things expecting them to fail. It just doesn't seem like a kind of mindset that one would accommodate going into it. I mean, we can think about life cycle, about how long things are going to last, but very often in this country anyway, the infrastructure that we build endures for a lot longer than the life cycle for which we plan it, just because we don't have the resources in order to replace it or refit it or whatever. And so the idea that you would build something that you didn't really want to walk away from, but you do it recognizing that it had a very strong chance of not being functional or being limited at some point in the future. I don't know if we really do that. And so I just, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about, how you think people, governments, local governments, communities should be thinking about this. I don't hear my locals, saying, well, we're going to build this pump station. We know it's only going to last 20 years. So, we built this. That the message that the public gets is we built the pump station, we've solved the problem, period. Not we've just delayed it and we're going to have to come back in 30 years and look at it again. So anyway, Philip, I don't know if you want to leave these questions up on the screen, but I that's kind of all I have in terms of presentation. I just, thought I'd be really interested to hear the thoughts of some others on these kinds of things and what experiences they've had with it.
Very good, Denise. Thank you for that presentation. I can tell you, just as we get into this discussion, just from the big map, it looked like it was anywhere from, a foot of rise to to 3 feet of rise on
Yeah.
the big spread that you had. And I know
Mhm.
that in the conversations we've had in the past around this topic, I think it was Val Mamarian was not able to. He's teaching a class today, so he wasn't able to make it. But the point he's made is that it's not the 3 feet of water. Yes, the 3 feet of water is very significant. He said it's what the wave action will do with that 3 feet of water when a storm comes in. He said it's just a multiplication effect as it comes on shore of how severe that is. And so um, this is a critical issue for us to talk about. I know that Gary's also indicated some. He's worked on a project in South Louisiana where they're trying to evacuate, I guess, an island of Indians north. The one Indian tribe down there that they're going to feel this in particular. So let me open it up to the group and Dr. Reed, if I can ask you just to go ahead and stop sharing for now so we can see each other and have that conversation. Very good.
Yeah.
All right. So if anyone would like to speak in, just unmute your mic and join the conversation. I'll mute my mic and allow the conversation to occur.
I have a question or observation. I apologize for moving positions about 5 times since this meeting started. I'm trying to get out of the wind now inside the houseboat. So anyway, we're sitting here on our cell phones. Like, how many of us still have a wall phone screwed to the wall of our home? So culturally, we've evolved since our parents' generation, so that what we're doing right now is pretty normal. In fact, it would seem odd for us to use a house phone or a wall phone unless we're maybe in an office setting. So my point is that we do adapt culturally on a very micro scale, individual choices in the aggregate, coming together. What I'm concerned about or wondering about is, I see the effects of the change in the water in my own backyard, but I'm grateful for all the big engineering projects, but I'm wondering what we can do. And Denise, maybe it speaks to somewhat of your concerns as well. How do we share the information? So for me, what I'm doing is I'm taking any organic material I can find and I'm putting along the bayou banks rather than allowing the bayou to fall into the soil to fall into the water. And I'm taking mulch material and I'm spreading it on my lawn, just allowing it to decompose over time. And all of, those are things that I can do without a bulldozer or an excavator or a major, funding from Congress. I guess, we'll always be interested. What can we do to change the hearts and the minds of individuals and how they interact with the wetlands and with the coast, so they don't see it as something that's being consumable and infinite, but something that needs to be preserved and nurtured and cared for. And we know it's not going to last. We know that within a generation or two, things will be dramatically different. But in those 2 generations, maybe we can begin to think differently about our wetlands, rather than just see them as these infinite consumable, things. So I'm not asking a real specific question other than I just continue to focus on what, individual, what I call postage stamp projects could do in the aggregate. So there's no question there, more just an observation, I guess.
No, I think that's a really good point, Charles. And I think if you can keep the elevation of your lot up, then it won't flood, but the road will flood and you won't be able to get there. And so I think perhaps more of this, I know I asked a question about homeowners and it sounds like you've got some good ideas there, but we're the kind of motivated people, right? I guess, how do we motivate others to do that? But then it's possible that people have the expectation that they're not going to be able to live where they can or live the same way. Usually people think that kind of adaptation that you described is for the better, right? So you use a cell phone, it's better, I can carry it with me. I don't have to run across the room to pick up the phone. But I just, how do we make this better for them? That maybe might lead to a little bit more adoption of different practices.
Well, here's a real good example. So in my community, there are a lot of people that are now millionaires because they've dug 40-foot deep borrow pits, which I completely get, because you need to have the material to build the levees, close to the thing. But now it looks like, Doulards have been crater bombed, and I'm worried about, within a few hundred yards, the bayou is right next to this enormous borrow pit. So what happens when the road undermines and the bayou now becomes the borrow pit? So, that's what I'm saying is that I completely understand the engineering reason for getting the dirt in proximity to the levee. But, you know, we already know that canal dredging was a bad idea back in the 60s. So is borrow pit digging 40 foot deep, you know, 200 yards from the bayou also a bad idea? My point is I don't think we're still viewing the wetlands as something consumable, you know, not something that needs to be nurtured and cared for, and, you know, immediately so. And again, if I were to tell my neighbor, hey man, you shouldn't make $1 million for selling you dirt, I mean, they think I was a complete idiot and a jerk and a poor neighbor. But at the same time, I said, dude, I'm glad you got a new boat, but you know, I'm really worried about this. It's just I don't know, what do you want to call it? You know, just a mindset, I guess, more than anything else.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Denise, thank you so much. That was interesting. It was nice seeing you. So, you know, one of the things, and this isn't exactly the same approach, but one of the things I try to do, like in my senior hydrologic design class, is a lot of times the students are working on projects in areas that haven't the design storms, the design, the characteristics of the system, you know, 30, 40 years ago were much different than they are today, let alone the rainfall, design rainfall depths, et cetera. So we actually try to spend a lot of time getting them to kind of understand, you know, this is, in essence, if you keep doing what has been done over the last several decades, right, in terms of infrastructure design, look at now the struggle you're up against, because now, you know, you've got to either convince the city or parish or whatever to enlarge the subsurface drainage infrastructure, which is so costly, right? And so you're having to look at other ways to mitigate or to reduce the stormwater runoff, you know, locally, or, you know, on a lot level, whatever. But but part of what we're able to do though is we're able to then use something like NOAA Atlas 14, where they've got, you know, updated rainfall depths, and they've got a confidence interval, and they kind of say, okay, you can use that upper bound and lower bound, and they kind of get that idea. I don't know if the rest of you, you know, so, you know, traditionally you just had one rainfall depth you were designing for, you know, some 10-year, 24-hour storm. Well, now, you know, NOAA has this great product where not only do you have that value, you've got kind of a upper and lower bounds on the 90% confidence interval. And they can use that to kind of think about how do you build in some, you know, I'm going to use the word resiliency. They may not be the right word, but let's go with that, right? And then they can put some costs on it. But when you start looking at the sea level rise, and I'm sorry, I think I'm getting to a question, okay?
That's okay. That's okay.
When you look at the plots you showed, you know, I think what some people, I'm going to say engineers, for example, might say is there a probability associated with those, right? Versus a high, intermediate, low, you know, but it's like, okay, but is that intermediate really the mean, or is it the high? You know, does that make sense what I'm saying? So then all of a sudden an engineer or somebody doesn't have that.
Yeah.
I have to stamp something based upon I use this probability.
Right.
Storm.
Yeah, I get it totally. And so this Atlas 14 stuff is really cool, folks, by the way. And Louisiana's trying to update its Atlas 14, which is great. But I mean, as Gary knows really well, scenarios are by definition not probabilistic, right? There's not a greater probability that people are going to do this versus this. It's one of these wicked problems that just say, well, we don't know what the probability is, so that's why we use scenarios.
Yeah.
And so you've got this kind of, within that big family of curves, you've got a set that's high and a set that's, you know, based on the different atmospheric conditions, the emissions concentration pathways. Yeah. And within those, there is an effort to do a probabilistic approach. And you should look at that Garner paper that is in Earth's Futures, but that because that points out which ones of these are probabilistic. But the probabilities are not about the atmospheric emissions. They're about the kind of model predictions, right? It's like the ensemble kind of, you know, what's the amount of them, and so you can do it probabilistically. I think the NOAA curves, are they probabilistic? Are they a bit more like the spaghetti plots that you know that NOAA does for hurricanes, where you see all the different pathways, and then NOAA, that's not like a mean of all of those. NOAA says this is the one, this is where we think it's going to go based on all of this information. So yeah, it's and so Clint brings up a really interesting point, which is that, you know, when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about coastal flooding coming from the coast. And the point that I can't remember if Philip or Charles made earlier is the idea that that then gets superimposed, or that Val made, right? Is that then you get coastal storms superimposed on that. I'm going to put storms over here for a little while, because that's another issue to deal with, right, Clint, is those episodic events. But so you've got the sea level rise coming up, but then in many parts of the coast, you've got the effect of rainfall too. In Louisiana, Lake Charles is a great example of this, where you've got rainfall coming down down the river, the Calcasieu River, interacting with a rising sea level, and perhaps a little bit. And those interactions are really complex to deal with. And so, so what I'm presenting is just one part of it. So if you layer on the storms thing, and you layer on the idea that there's water coming down too, I'm sure Clint can teach his students how to deal with this, but it's really complex, right, Clint? And I'd suggest that a lot of the people working in agencies like DOTD in Louisiana, or parish governments, you know, or municipal governments, you know, may not, you know, be able to do that on their desk themselves, and may not have the resources to be able to hire a consultant who can do it for them, if they have the awareness that it needs to be done. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, a lot of you work with, you know, people who do things in government, and, you know, maybe I'm underestimating the skill set in lots of places. I hope so.
Yeah, I'm not even sure. And that's interesting, because you're thinking about the skill set versus the inertia, right? Of a government, you know, DOTD. I mean, their hydraulics manual still doesn't, you know, I mean, the local parishes and communities will say use no Atlas 14, but if you just go to DOTD, right, it's still based on whatever it is, TR 55 or something, right? You see what I'm saying? And so kind of thinking about the translation of that into actionable, and actually having a government agency maybe understanding they may need to update design frequencies or probabilistic events, right? Every 5 or 10, their design guidelines more frequently than what they're used to, or what the inertia allows for. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not, but
yeah, I think the analogy that comes to mind, you know, is for storms, right? Where after Katrina, we got this major event. I'm not talking about the storm. I'm talking about the flooding and the loss of life and economic damages associated with it. As a storm was just a storm. I mean, we've had big ones before, but that led to a real rethink about moving from standard project hurricane, right, to this new way of doing things, about how we think about hurricanes and how deep storm surges are going to be, which is more probabilistic, as Clint described. And it seemed to me that we haven't really got there yet with, from a hydraulics point of view, base level, which is what sea level is about. We haven't really got there yet with this, and maybe. But the other thing about sea level rise, of course, is it's chronic, right? Just it's slow and chronic, and so it's when you get the acute event superimposed on it that you see this effect. But then we tend to start dealing with the acute effect and the storms, not the sea level, not the chronic. You know, it's you know, I'm sure there are lots of healthcare analogies in there somewhere, but anyway, I think that how we train people, I think, you know, and how folks like Clint can do that is a really good one. But how folks, I don't know if Jonathan may not still be on, but how folks like Jonathan, who works directly with people trying to build things, or Gary and his team, you know, work with people, advising people that are trying to do things, how we advise them, and how Charles kind of, you know, cultivate, you know, really, you know, promotes the increasing awareness at a local level. I mean, I think this is all really, it's got to attack this from all kinds of sides to get awareness going. But what I was trying to point out today is it's not just a matter of getting people to accommodate oh yeah, I'm going to use sea level rise. I want to get sea level rise in this project. What do I do? That's not an easy answer. And so that was what I kind of wanted to kind of get today.
I'm building a little bit on what Charles said about, the cultural and the social aspects of this. And I'm not an engineer, so and I speak highly of engineers, even though they think we're going to engineer ourselves out of these problems in a lot of ways. But you mentioned, Denise, and what really wrong with me is two things. One, why would we plan to build something that's going to fail? And number two is, are we getting the right guidance, using the right language to the right places? Because I think we can have this conversation in government and in policy and in the scientific world, but at some point, you wonder how much of this is going to be influenced by other effects, and that is, you can't get insurance. You can't get a loan to build this thing anywhere. And so I just wonder, are those kind of more social constructs also receiving the right guidance that's coming from the science? I really don't know the answer to that, but it may be that we migrate or we change the way and where we build based on completely other factors than the science, which is, like I said, you can't get a loan, you can't get insurance, which is a lot different than you can't get permitted for this. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think I don't know too much about how the insurance kind of rating works. I know a little bit about how groups like RMS and CoreLogic and groups like that kind of provide information to insurance companies about risk. And they tend, I think, not to think long term. I'm pretty sure they do those analyses on almost an annual basis, because you can cancel somebody's insurance tomorrow, essentially. You can remove yourself from an insurance market. A private insurer can remove themselves from a market relatively readily. And so I don't think they really look a lot far into the future. Mortgages and banking, that aspect of finance, I don't think that we've got a lot of traction there yet. I don't know. I haven't actually. It'd be interesting to think about whether or not how easy it is to get a mortgage in some of the lower lying parts of where I live in Terrebonne, or down towards Pointe-Shan and places like that. I think that. I think part of the other thing about that, Gary, may be that people tend to think about risk as being not a gradation, but being a binary state. I'm at risk or I'm not at risk. I'm going to flood or I'm not going to flood. I'm behind the levee or I'm not behind the levee. I'm protected or I'm not. And that, of course, is something else to struggle with. I think that would be a really, and from what I understand, maybe some other folks on the call today know a little bit more about it, but when, what's it called? Flood Risk 2.0, whatever the new approach that FEMA is going to come out with eventually, that we've been waiting for, that's going to replace the flood insurance mapping approach, is that each house is going to have its own, each property is going to have its own risk profile.
Right.
And that, if that successfully includes future thinking about sea level rise, and that could be a really powerful tool to engender change. One of the challenges with that is that not everybody is going to be able to respond. And, most of us on the call, many of us, I'll just speak for myself, I could move, I guess, if I wanted to. I don't have to, actually, because my house is 10 feet off the ground already. But those who can move will move. And those who can't afford to move, where all of their equity is in their house, and, they can't sell it because of all these issues, then they will be disproportionately affected. And then you get into that vicious kind of cycle of poor
Right.
people living in dangerous places and suffering even more because they're stuck in the dangerous places.
Yeah, it very quickly becomes an equity issue. So was it realestate.com or realtor.com or one of those a few months ago? And I didn't know about this until a reporter called and asked me, started putting a flood assessment. So if you pull up the listing of a house, it also tells you you're in this floodplain, this is what your risk is, this is what flood insurance is going to cost you. And the only thing I could think to say was precisely what you said. Well, that's today, but if that, there's only a couple of flood insurance companies, and if they decide to leave that market, so what that leads people to do is conflate this decision about a 30-year investment in this home, and they make this part of the decision that, well, I have this house for 30 years and I'm only going to pay $600 a year in flood insurance, if it's even available in 3 years, 5 years, tomorrow. So I think that, as you rightfully point out, we could do a better job of providing guidance, not just among government and academia, but people have to make those decisions on a day-to-day basis. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, it would be interesting to think about I was going to say the commissioner of insurance, but in Louisiana, the commissioner of that department of state government doesn't actually have anything to do with flood insurance. They do other kinds of insurance, but wherever that gets considered, whether or not those the Public Service Commission or whatever those entities are that oversee those kinds of markets, would be really interesting to see how they're thinking about things like this.
Let me add to that part of the conversation, because Albert Slapp, who is a former member of our E-Club, has a company called Coastal Consulting Group, and they do this very similar to what Gary just indicated, provide risk-based flood maps for any properties that you have in mind. And he's been keeping me on the loop on a lot of articles that are coming out from the insurance industry, the large-scale rental industries of buildings and properties, of this concern of sea level rise. They're recognizing the significance of it, especially from a lending perspective, because whereas the insurance market can pull out, if you are holding the loan on a $100 million or $1 billion building, which is located in one of these areas where the sea level rise could have a catastrophic effect, and it gets wiped out, and it doesn't have insurance, you're left holding the bag. And so there's a lot of financial institutions that are very interested in this topic. And again, it's the idea of what can they realistically do? They want to lend the money, but and it goes back to what Dr. Wilson was indicating earlier, this idea of a risk factor. What's the probability of this really happening? And that you would hate to not loan the money and then find out, well, nothing really happened, or you would hate to loan the money and say, well, something really did happen. So it goes right back to what Dr. Reed is saying, is that it's important that somehow we get a number, and finding that number is the difficult part. I would also like to address very quickly this issue of building something that's not going to last. I think engineers do that all the time. It's just they put down roads for projects that they're going to need to build in a location, and then 3 months later they tear the road up because they don't need the road anymore. So there are things that are designed not to last, and maybe what the answer may be is that, as far as a wake up call to people on the coast, because that's what the point of our club, Dr. Reed, is we hope to communicate with other coastal communities your presentation through the Rotary clubs in their area, and then have their residents listen to the presentation as well, to allow them to make decisions moving forward of what it is that they want to do. For example, they may have a house that's wiped out in a hurricane on the coast, and instead of building the $5 million superstructure, they just build a very, very moderate house that, if it goes down, well, it just goes down. In these major cities, I know that Miami is seriously considering. I mean, they may even have to put a levee around the whole thing eventually, just because of the issues that they're having to deal with. But because of that, the costs are just astronomical. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it has not been adequately communicated to the population as a whole, because the population as a whole may have a different reaction than most people think. They may want to sell quickly in order to avoid holding onto the property too long, and that's going to just disrupt the real estate values, which of course disrupts the loan market. So, but with all that, there's just things that are going on that makes this issue such a critical nature for us to be able to address and provide. And it goes back to your slide. If you can pull up your slide, Dr. Reed, again, of what you had initially as the 4 questions that we needed to address before we get off the line, because I'd like to have you put that back up, and then if you could just go back over these quickly with us, and then we're gonna sign off. But I just want you to. These are important issues, and so if you can just go through those issues one more time, and then we'll thank you for your presentation.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for. I mean, I think the idea of how, given that there are these array of sea level rise predictions for the future, what guidance should we give homeowners and communities, and what kind of time span should they be thinking about in the future? How should we think about sea level rise at the kind of governmental level when we're planning new investments in roads or hospitals or kind of public infrastructure, those critical and essential facilities that we all rely on, that we pay our taxes towards? What do we want those to? How do we want those to kind of endure? And how do we want those monies to be expended? Because those are our monies, essentially. Building things that we expect to fail. I think this idea that we might shift our approach, which was what was suggested here, that there may be things that we do temporarily. I mean, like ice roads in the Arctic, potentially, or board roads across wetlands. Oil and gas has been doing that for a long time here. Can we do things where the investment is not so great, but the life cycle is not so great? And so, and I think the idea of how we can expect to spend less now, but spend again at some point in the future, is the kind of thing that maybe we need to get to. And I think that actually is the answer, perhaps, to this last question. Is dramatic early action easier to accept than later failure? Is it worth investing when you build the house to raise it off the ground higher than the BFE requires, rather than to have that flooding issue to deal with later? And if so, how do you pay for it? And whether that's a private home, can you get the mortgage to get that extra couple of feet, or how do local governments pay for it, and things like that? So these are just, there are loads more questions than this, but I think these are worth considering and thinking about as people try to work out how they're going to handle sea level rise.
Dr. Reed, if you can stop this screen share for a moment. Thank you very much. We want to thank you for your presentation. I want to encourage all Rotarians that watch this video, get with your local. I think what we've done is begun the conversation, and to spread this conversation just beyond listening to it on a Zoom video that you may watch, but actually take it to your local representatives and your local councilmen in your city, as well as within your work environment, to start talking about it collectively within your work environment, to start to address these issues, and how you may, as an organization, address, not just for your own company, but for the clients that you serve, this important topic of sea level rise. It is rising. That is a fact. The extent of its rise in the future is still up in the air, but it is rising. And it's a good thing to talk about, of how you can assist your community in addressing sea level rise in the future. So, Dr. Reed, I want to thank you for your time today. If you'd like to get a certificate of attendance, please email us at eRotaryCoastal@gmail.com.